One of the capabilities we have that will greatly simplify managing permissions is inheritance. Inheritance is nothing but assigning permissions at a top level, and the permissions automatically inherit and apply to files, subfolders under that parent. As an example, let's say I take sales managers, that Active Directory group, and I assign them the allow modify permission for the sales reports folder. My challenge is I have thousands of reports that are generated every year. Inside of the sales reports, I want some way to structure those. So I decide I'm going to break it down based on each month of the year. So I have this Jan reports folder that contains all the sales reports from January. Well, when I create this subfolder, because inheritance is enabled by default, the sales managers automatically are assigned the allow modify. It inherits down to this folder. So now I don't need to go to the January folder and ever directly assign permissions. I can simply assign permissions one time at the sales reports, and I just know it inherits through that entire structure. Now, inheritance is enabled by default, but it does take some planning. You have to accept that everything you put in the sales reports folder, every file, every subfolder, by default is going to inherit those permissions. So let's say for whatever reason, you have another folder here, and we're going to call it archive sales reports. So from previous years. Now, not a lot of people need access to the archive sales reports. Sales managers do not. So arguably, you probably should not have put that in sales reports, since the permissions that are assigned at the sales reports level will also apply to this archive sales report. Should really be in a completely separate structure, would be a best practice. But you do have the option to go to a folder and you can actually disable inheritance. If you do that, you simply tell this folder, the archive sales reports, that it no longer gets permissions assigned from its parent. All permissions now have to be directly assigned at the archive sales reports folder itself. So disabling this is one option. Now, a few other characteristics. I said my January reports folder, it would inherit permissions from sales reports, which is true. But you can also still assign permissions here. So if I wanted to add another group just to the January reports folder, I could still go to the January folder and I could still assign permissions. It would simply be in addition to the permissions that have been inherited. So it's not as if you lose the ability to assign permissions to the January reports folder. What you can never do, though, since sales managers modify, we said was assigned at the sales reports, you could not go to your subfolder and remove that permission because it's not directly assigned. It's only applying through inheritance. Now, to put a face to that, I have my sales reports folder on my desktop. I'm just going to drag that over a bit. Right now, there are no contents in this folder. I'm going to right click and create a new folder, and I'm just going to name it Jan Reports. If I go back to the properties of the sales reports itself and the security tab, you can see that sales users has modify. Now again, I'm at the sales reports folder, the parent. If I click edit, I can select sales users and I can change those permissions at the parent folder. I don't want to change those though, so I'm just going to click cancel. Now if I open the sales reports, I'm going to right click Jan Reports and I'm going to go to Properties, Security tab. When I edit, notice Sales Users automatically shows up because inheritance is enabled. But when I select it, I do not have the ability to turn off any of those permissions. Modify and below, that is assigned to this subfolder through inheritance, so I cannot modify it here lest I turn off inheritance. Now, I could assign other permissions, and I could add other users, groups that need access. You just cannot directly modify the inherited permissions. Now, as we said, I'm going to create another folder, and I'm going to name this archive sales reports. Now, if we go to the properties of this folder, as expected, when I go to the security tab, sales users shows up. They have inherited permissions. What I can do is click the advanced button. Now, I'm on the properties of the archive sales reports folder. There's an option to disable inheritance. When I do that, it's going to ask me if I want to convert inherited permissions into explicit permissions, or do I simply want to remove inherited permissions? Now, what that means to me, if I convert, notice for all of these permissions here, sales users, administrator, all the way down, it says inherited from, and it gives me this path. So what I can do is actually remove those permissions, and they completely disappear. So now no one has access to this. I would have to add whatever groups need access and just manually assign permissions. At any time, you could come back and enable inheritance. And when I apply, it automatically adds those back in. But if I click disable once more, as we saw here, let me just pull that down, inherited from, we know they cannot be changed at the subfolder level. So what I'm going to do is click convert inherited permission into explicit permission. That's a fancy way to say turn off inheritance, but as you do it, copy the permissions exactly the same and apply them directly to this folder. So now inheritance is turned off. I know that because it says inherited from none. Well, now if I just OK this and go back to edit, now if I click on sales users, even though I'm on the subfolder archive sales reports, I can modify those permissions because they're no longer delivered through inheritance. This is another one of those things that is like 99% planning, 1% implementation. But that's what we wanted to look at there. I'm done with this structure, so I'm just going to actually right-click and delete that sales reports altogether. We don't need it for anything, just clutters the desktop.